Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the Effective Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Jackson, and we are in episode 85. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Judy Willis. She's been a neuroscience for 15 years and a teacher for 10 years after that. And she's going to talk to us and explain to us the neuroscience behind how students learn and what we can do in our classroom to help make sure that our students are getting the understanding and the knowledge that they need to be successful in their learning and to be motivated for future learnings that come. Well, Judy, thank you so much for joining me today for this podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about the basics of how students actually learn?
The basics of
how students learn.
How students learn. Easy. They learn when they feel good. How do we all learn? It's pretty, I'll be happy to go into the dopamine and the amygdala and the neurochemistry and the genetics. But learning only takes place when we go from the unknown, progress beyond it. It's not learning when you repeat things. So it's important to think that learning means extending beyond your safety net. It means the satisfaction. The whole brain is devised to respond with positivity when you push your boundaries and get the feedback you're making progress. So learning is going from the unknown to the known. But it has to do with the unknown.
Yeah, and how does that actually happen? How does that happen for our students in their brains and stuff? How do they get new knowledge and actually store it away and keep it and be able to recall it later?
Okay. Years ago, someone said, what are the major three things? And on the spur of the moment, the three letters I came up with are still pretty true. R-A-D. So it's rad teach or rad, there's a website, but R-A-D, R, reticular activating system, the entry system that determines what information even gets in through a significant attention filter. The R isn't just part of RAD, it's RAS, reticular activating system. It's way down in the lowest part of the brain, just above the spinal cord. So information, then we can talk about what gets through, but everything that we learn has to start by coming through the senses. What gets through from the senses has to be accepted by this very important filter that's really discriminating. This RAS in the low brain is only letting in about 1% of the millions of bits of sensory data reporting in every second. If the information that the brain is going to learn makes it through this attention filter, reticular activating system, RAS, if it makes it through there, it still has to reach, ultimately, the furthest part away from it in the brain, the prefrontal cortex. It's below the forehead. It couldn't be further away from the entry point way back here to here. So imagine a diagonal from your forehead to your bottom of your, up the top of your neck, and that's where information has to travel. If it wasn't just a matter of distance, there's even something else that's going to be another barrier. Remember, attention filter is going to block out 99%, one out of it more than that. Although I've taught algebra and maths, the brain's only letting in 1% of the millions of bits every second. If the information from the senses is accepted, before it'll even get to the prefrontal cortex, it next has to go through an emotional filter, a switching station. The limbic system, it's in the middle of the brain. It's deep in the brain, one on each side. That has to be allowing a comfortable passage. It can't be overworked. And we can talk about how stress puts that in the red zone. sorry, you made it through the first filter. Now you're not. Now you're going back to the low brain where the response is fight, flight, freeze. If it makes it through the attention filter and this amygdala's emotional filter and gets through the memory, short-term, long-term, makes it up there to the prefrontal cortex, then there needs to be mental manipulation to take this sensory data, connect it with prior knowledge, and construct it into understanding, which by design, as Jay and I work about, is going to connect it to other neural networks to make it become long-term memory. Without understanding, all of that work won't work. All of that work won't work. So it really does, as I've learned from Jay McTighe, is backward design. So if you really want something to reach the prefrontal cortex to become durable, understanding, and long-term memory, you better know what's happening from the entry point to the emotional switching station to transferring it from short-term memory to understanding to enduring long-term memory.
Okay, and so is that just R that you've talked about there of the RAD letters, or is that all of them?
Everything.
That was everything?
Everything you know went through, everything you understand.
Yeah.
Everything you understand now went through that passage.
Yeah. So you were talking about RAD, R-A-D, as your three letters.
I see.
And so you've done R. Have you done A and D?
R was the reticular activating system. That's the RAS is the R, reticular activating system. Okay. A is the amygdala, the emotional switching station that when it's in a hyper state of excitability, usually from stress, it's going to block passage up to the memory. And it's also going to block executive function down to manage reflective responses. So just back to the RAD, R, reticular activating system for attention, A, amygdala, the emotional switching station to get on further. D is dopamine. It's my favorite neurochemical. It doesn't mean it's a good neurotransmitter or a bad one. We have hundreds of them, almost probably now more than 200. So some people say, oh, so dopamine's the good neurotransmitter. No, too much of anything, coffee or anything, too much. So too much dopamine is schizophrenia. So I'm not saying there's good and bad, but let me promise you something. On my reputation as a neurologist, a neuroscientist, no teaching experience has ever overdosed a student's brain with too much dopamine that it caused schizophrenia. But it's such a positive. We understand the positive desire of achievement, achieving a challenge that we've all experienced. You know, I set a goal, I worked at it, I saw progress. Not that I had to wait until I ran a marathon 6 months later. I saw progress each time I clocked myself. I saw progress as a baby. Yeah, I'd fall down a lot, but now it worked a little better. This dopamine neurotransmitter is released when the brain sees two things: an achievable challenge. So the brain won't put out effort. We can talk about why the brain is programmed not to put out effort and energy because it's there for survival or breathing. But with this perfect Goldilocks zone, dopamine is the ticket that gets the brain motivated to persevere, to sustain through setbacks and mistakes and embarrassment. It's why the brain puts out the effort to keep going. It feels so good. And the video game model demonstrates it. We can go into more about how it works in a video game, but that's the neurochemistry that promotes sustained motivation and perseverance through mistakes.
That's fantastic.
That
So with
R-A-D.
yeah, so rad. So with rad, I can already, as a teacher, start to see things that I should be doing to make sure that that's working really well. Like for the reticular activating system, I think I got that right. I need to make sure that my students are focused and paying attention. And so I'm sure there's things that we can do to promote that. When it comes to the amygdala, we need to make sure that our students emotionally are feeling, safe and well and are in a good place for learning and not feeling anxious about things, not stressed because of life at home and those kinds of things. And then D, where we
Dopamine. Dopamine.
so with dopamine, we're then looking at like celebrating, I guess, the success
That's
that they
our
have.
fuel. That's
Yeah.
our fuel. That's what we know. That's what nobody has to teach an infant to keep getting up and trying, because each time they recognize progress, they'll go, even with mistakes. So dopamine is what we can hook onto, that we've found that hooks video gamers. And on the overdose side, it's gamblers or addiction, but it's a brain chemical that's there to resist the other thing that the brain is pretty much programmed for, which is survival. And for the brain's survival, it wants to conserve all the energy it has. The brain weighs 2.5 kilograms and uses 20% of all the oxygen and glucose that the whole body gets. This little teeny thing is sucking up all of this stuff. So if the brain is programmed for survival of the animal and species, it's not going to get off the couch for, I made a mistake on that, who cares about maths anymore? So dopamine is the counter to that. It's a natural system in there, but we need to hook it. It's already there for animals in the wild, for little kids. But school is not natural. None of us feel, oh yeah, I couldn't wait for the next math test or Spanish test. So dopamine is the other end that the brain is presenting us. Hey, I'm here to survive. Try to get me to expend my glucose and oxygen for anything other than breathing, respiration, or survival. That's the other system that the brain has, but we need to hook it.
So how then do we hook it? So in our classrooms, what can teachers do to really help our students to get the new learning that they're getting, take it through the RAD system, have them actually mentally manipulate the information, be successful and experience that dopamine hit? How do we do that with our students?
Okay, I'll try to be concise. We can come back to any part you want more details of, because hopefully you're going to edit this, but anyway, the reticular activating system, this filter that lets in about 1% of millions of sensory data. So to explain what that means, you have sensory nerve endings everywhere outside your body and inside your body, in your internal organs. In a square millimeter of fingertip, you have more than 100 receptors, and they're not the same. They're not just for touch. You have in that 100 touch, pressure, proprioception, up or down, heat, cold, sharp, dull. So all of these sensory nerve endings, if you're healthy, are sending data continuously. That's the only job. Here I'm a nerve ending in your finger that's acknowledging how much pressure's on me. All of that is reporting to the RAS continuously. Really, could you even possibly evaluate independently those millions of bits of data and decide what you want? No. So for survival purposes, there's a system. So we want to know, how do we get our information, our sensory data? Because the brain only learns when it accepts what it hears, sees, touches, feels, moves. How do we get what we want to be accepted into their brains selected out of these millions of bits? Well, we do know from neuroimaging and neuroelectric studies that the intake filter, this reticular activating system, RAS, gives priority to number one is threat, which I'm going to put aside, even though it's big. If there's not a big perception of threat or danger, it gives priority to what has changed. What's different? Because every animal, every fox that comes out of a hole in its morning has plenty of sensory information, smell, touch, taste, movements. So the RAS, reticular activating system, is programmed to select what is different, what wasn't there yesterday, what isn't part of the usual experience. So you can go on from there. So the goal is, once we've made sure that there's not a perception of danger and threat, the input that will get selected for students is what is a unexpected but not scary sound, taste, visual, smell, movement. So walking backwards, if the students are coming in at any grade level or a faculty meeting, and the teacher's walking backwards, handing out the papers or saying good morning, the brain will alert. The RAS will let that information in, will give it priority because it's not the usual pattern. So here's the RAS, the reticular activating system. If something is unexpected, different from the usual pattern, patterns are what it does. So that fox that came out of its den, if everything is the same as usual, but now there's a wolf howling, or now there's a little mouse running by that could be breakfast, that gets priority intake to attention. So there's a lot more, but I could, a lot more specific things, changes in color, changes in what someone is wearing, changes in sound, not words. The RAS does not know language, but volume, cadence, movement, their movement, your movement, colors. That's why we sometimes send home Friday folders of a different color if you want the parents to actually read them. So that gets priority through the attention filter. Then what's going to get through the next filter? The amygdala. Should I go on, or is that?
Yeah, no, please.
Okay.
Keep going.
So here's this next filter. Everything that this teeny one out of millions of bits gets in through the attention filter. What happens when it gets up to the next filter? Well, the amygdala, the emotional filter, the affective filter, it's going to let that information go somewhere. That's good news. But where it goes, well, as we've learned from neuroimaging and neuroelectric studies, when part of the brain is particularly activated, is being used a lot, is, just to say activated, we can see on imaging that it's using more glucose, or using more hemoglobin or oxygen. So we see these things on PET scan or neuroimaging or fMRI studies. So we can see what happens that makes the amygdala build up its metabolic activity so that it becomes a block, a stop sign, a red light. So here's information nicely flowing in, trying to get to the prefrontal cortex for memory. But if the amygdala has already hit that red zone, it's not going to get access. What's going to happen to it? As I said, it's going to go somewhere. But where? It's going to be deflected to, let's call it the lower brain. It's not going to be shot back out through the RAS to the spinal cord. It's going to go to the survival-oriented 80% of the brain we call the lower brain, where survival is still the primary behavioral response, fight, flight, freeze. So if the amygdala has been put into that stress state where perceives, even though it's not true, if it perceives threat and it gets more and more reactive, we see more and more hypermetabolic oxygen use, glucose use. It becomes red is just the color of the imaging that we use. But as we see that get more and more metabolically active, instead of passage up, that information is sent, kind of up, but laterally to the reactive behavior brain. And that's when stress results in reaction, fight, flight, freeze, which in humans is acting out or zoning out. And even at best, it's not allowing passage into memory.
So how do we then help? How do we help it to let the information through?
Two big things. Consider, now we'll go back to what I didn't spend time on a few minutes ago about the intake filter, the reticular activating system. I did indicate that it's programmed to specifically or give priority intake to information that the mammal perceives as potential threat. So no matter what other colors and movement and great things are coming in, if there's something coming in that's perceived as threat, that system, RAS, will let it in, but it'll shoot it right to that lower behavioral brain. So now let's go back to what that means. If the information got through it, and you're hitting an amygdala that's been stressed, I feel threatened, I've failed at this before, my parents expect all A's, or I can never do, my mindset is that I can never do oral presentations, or I'd rather just die than do another oral presentation. If that amygdala is in that state, even if it wiggles through the intake filter, the input is going to still go to that lower reactive fight, flight, freeze brain. So that's where the rules for what gets in through attention and what gets through the amygdala merge. If there's perceived threat, or if it even makes it up further and the mammal has low expectations of success, or doesn't realize it's unachievable, or that it's a challenge. We're coming back to the beginning. So how do we get it through the amygdala? The amygdala is there primarily as a blocker, shoot down to the lower reactive brain. But the survival of mammals is sustained by continued behavior to promote growth and perseverance through mistakes and motivation through mistakes. Otherwise, things wouldn't evolve. So, as we've learned with dopamine and with the video game model and what I call, I'm sure I'm not the only one, the Goldilocks zone, here's what the amygdala will stop being a blocker. First, helping students recognize that they have this amygdala, that when they are acting out or zoning out, they're not bad, they're not lazy, they're not unintelligent, they don't have a disease. I mean, yeah, everyone should be checked. But the reason I left my neurology practice and became a teacher was because way too many kids were diagnosed because of behavior. And really, there were no 9-year-old sociopaths. Really, there are not. I mean, it's just the brain doesn't do that. So what kids need to know, parents, teachers, that behavior is usually a reactive response to a stressed out amygdala that isn't letting, not only is it not letting information up into memory and understanding, but now we're hitting a new place when it's also blocking top-down flow. In this ultimate high-end real estate, this prefrontal cortex, where we need information to get to construct enduring understanding and conceptual memory. Also up there are their developing executive function, among which and critical to which are understanding one's own emotions and recognizing when stress is building and having the facility to recognize it and do something about it. So starting as young as possible, things like mindfulness, breathing, counting, understanding that their brain is not defective, that their brain, when it's putting them into the fight, flight, freeze, reactive response, it's what it's supposed, designed to do. But by showing them, oh, look at these emojis on the wall. Which one are you feeling now? When you feel like that, what happens to you? Having them check in 15 minutes later, what do you feel now on these emojis, or describe it? So having students recognize the emotional state they're in, and not at the same time, separately, like building a skill, like going to physical education or music class, building the skill, the powerful skill of reflective response, whether it's breathing, visualizing, counting to 10, thinking of some optimistic thought, thinking of some positive future, opportunity, kindness, gratitude. Turns out that those things not only build the prefrontal cortex executive function for top-down messages to the amygdala to quiet it, they also build one's own confidence that it's not them.
Okay, so essentially what you're saying is if we can help our students to manage their emotions, it's going to help that information come through the reticular activating system. So it's their system, and then
Yes.
get through the amygdala up into the prefrontal cortex. Is that what? Yes.
You've got
cool. Where it's then going to be manipulated and stuff, and then if they are successful in their manipulations, then they get their dopamine hit, which then stirs on further motivation. It helps them to keep going with that. So in my classroom, if I remind them of previous times where they've been successful and stuff, does that help them to set that up for success too?
Yes, and what will happen is it builds up over time, just like a negative mindset I can't do this, builds up over time. Remember that achievable challenge, the biggest boost, this release of dopamine, doesn't even have to get to the prefrontal cortex. It's kind of a whole brain thing. Dopamine, when it's released, floats around the brain. It's not just a little synapse, it's a neurotransmitter, but when dopamine is released and bathes the brain, the outcome in mammals includes increased memory, motivation, pleasure, satisfaction, memory, I may have said memory, and perseverance and attention. So what we want is, what is the most profound way to cause that really positive state of mind from RAS, reticular activating system, to amygdala, to prefrontal cortex, to memory, to life, is experiencing the things that release dopamine. So I'll talk more, but I did mention achieving a challenge. Other things that turn out to release whole brain dopamine, and those wonderful things such as sustained motivation, memory, perseverance, attention, that whole nice cluster. Other things that turn out to release it include listening to music, being told stories, humor, movement, gratitude, kindness. Those experiences also bathe the brain in this dopamine. But to me, the most powerful one is one I'll relate to you and listeners: achieving a challenge. So let's start with something that's the opposite of achieving a challenge, because I'm really strong on both words, achieving and challenge. So let's start with challenge. If I gave you a maths test and it was adding single digit numbers, okay, that's it. 1 plus 3, 4 plus 2, and you answered all 20 questions correctly. Give you back your test at this age, not when you're 1. Get your test back, you get 100%. You're not going to feel that great. You're going to say, of course, right? I mean, unless you have.
Yeah. I'd be very disappointed if I didn't get 100%.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So if it's too easy, then it's no longer a challenge. Remember, achievable challenge. So the brain is going to look at something like in a video game, when if everyone had to play the video game at the same level, and if everyone had to stay at level 1, even when they mastered out of 10 levels, even though they mastered that task, whether aiming or ranging, if they had to stay there until everybody else playing that video game achieved that task, okay, that's not going to work. There's not going to be any dopamine, because the brain says, if I don't see both aspects, a challenge and that it's achievable, it really has to be both. So alternately, I just got to go skiing. I got to go somewhere for the first time in a year. I got to go skiing last week. And to my surprise, at this particular mountain in Colorado, it only had high, intermediate, and advanced runs. Now, I have been skiing for much of my adult life, but this was a 15-minute ride up a gondola and looking below me at this steep, mogly thing. So my brain's saying, just go home. I mean, I didn't want to put out the effort, the energy. It would rather survive. Remember, it's still there for survival. And it's really not going to get off the couch and use its glucose or its oxygen to ski down this terrifying thing. It's a challenge, all right, but it didn't perceive it as achievable. Well, fortunately, I was able to get a teacher who was my teacher that guided me through these runs that made them achievable. And I expected that. I spent all my money on that. But that's what happens in a kid's brain. If they have confidence, it's achievable, that they'll have the support, that they'll have alternative ways, different levels of reading that information until they get to the level that the teacher believes they'll get to. So my teacher wasn't putting me on the hardest run at the beginning. She started me off at a place where I could recognize progress. So that's what makes the dopamine go and keep me going, even when I fell down. Okay, I fell down, but look, I made a few turns on a scary place. So the brain will put out, as will the body, directed by the brain, the effort and persevere through the mistakes when a teacher guides through the expectation and provides the support that it's an achievable challenge. And on the other hand, if they would have started me on the next door mountain, which was a more beginner mountain where I probably would have had more fun the first day, which is what they kept saying, oh, I think you want to go over to Snowmass. That would have been boring.
Yeah.
So the brain would have said, okay, so what? My skis are closer together. So the ideal situation, and this is what happens in the most compelling video games or skiing experiences, a teacher recognizing individually, or at least into small groups, or through flipped classrooms, or pre-planning, or personalizing, what will make this student's brain say, hey, this is achievable with effort, but I see how I could get there. And it's still a challenge. And I see that you expect that I can achieve it. That's what it takes. And it's so profound. And that's why I say teaching isn't brain surgery. It's harder because I've done both. And brain surgery, everything is set up with one task. Okay, it's a big deal. You're in the brain, but it's really cut something nicely, sew it back nicely, put something in nicely. One task, full focus on one task. No other distractions. I was never chief resident there to decide what music was being played, but one task. Cut, sew, and be there for emergencies. But every day in a teacher's life, in the 10 years after my practicing of neurology, every day, each teacher, for every student, for every minute, there are so many factors, as we've talked about, determining what's getting in through attention, what's getting in through the emotional filter, what's making it up to the prefrontal cortex, and are we keeping the emotional filter believing that there's a challenge and it's achievable so it doesn't flip into fight, flight, freeze, act out, zone out. That's so much easier than
Beautiful.
task.
So then, as we give our teachers something to do this week relating to all this, should they start by, I don't know, maybe introducing music at the beginning of the lesson to get some more dopamine into the kids' brains, tell a joke at the start, or is it more effective to give the students a small achievable challenge, maybe as they come into the class, that'll help them to get into the right mind frame, I guess, or mindset for the learning that's going to come that day?
Great question. Be prepared to get 3 things that video games do. If there's a video game that someone, who's a gamer, is going to keep playing despite making mistakes, and, there are 10 levels, and it's what's going to keep them invested and what's going to keep the brain invested. 3 things. RAS, reticular activating system. Attention will be paid to something, remember, unless there's a lot of threat, to what's curious, what's changed, what's different, what's a buy-in goal. Why should I let this information in? So if you're going to teach a lesson in nutrition that is not their favorite thing, or a faculty meeting about sexual harassment, if it's not a big hot topic, what's going to get their brain and say, okay, I might let that in? So the things that will get through the attention filter the most, once there's not perceived threat, changes in color, movement, volume of sound, not necessarily louder or softer, but if I talk like a robot, or walking backwards when they come in. So, or a great curious photo or video when they come in. That is going to connect with what comes next. So now they're hooked, a hook. So they come in, they see something, that's not so bad. And they know, because of experience with you, that, that curious optical illusion is going to have something to do with this maths lesson. Okay, the RAS is going to let it in. Then, once they're hooked, then understanding what their goal will be. Okay, this was curious. It's not going to keep their RAS open all day. What are they going to get out of this? So a short-term goal is, that's curious. A longer-term goal is, so what's in it for me? Oh, here's a longer-term goal. I will get to make a color wheel, a slide, even write a letter to somebody who's important. What will I get if I then go on to gain this information that you've now showed me a video about? So they're hooked by the RAS and the color, movement, sound. They're hooked. Okay, I'm interested. This isn't the usual boring stuff. Then showing them options of what you have to know them. We all know that. What hooks them and sustains their attention? Is it robots? Is it working in groups? Is it working on computers? We have to know our learners, and knowing that, say, well, taking this a little bit further, this is what you can do with it. Then, before you lose them, because they say, oh, I thought it would be another oral presentation. No, how will they build their understanding and demonstrate their skills so that they can get the goal that they want? And especially important, okay, I can see how learning the periodic table of elements, oh, I see it's horizontal and vertical. I see, and you're going to let me use that on the test. So I see that one over and one down, or a mathematical multiplication, whatever tools. They see what they want to use it for. Otherwise, who cares? Just another graph. But if they see what they want to use it for, and they have now the achievable challenge, how are you going to give them different ways of reaching that goal through different levels of reading, through flipped classroom, through Khan Academy, through Udio, so 5 different levels of the same material in books that's labeled 1 to 5, but they're not showing everyone, oh, look, everyone, I'm on 1. No, saying, I know you can get to level 5 mastery and your goal, but the system is set up so that they can see they're making progress to the goal that you've confidently let them know that they can achieve and what they'll do with it. That's it. It's not so fancy. It does take time, and like brain surgery, it means a teacher's own achievable challenge. One cannot have a high school class of 50, 100 students 3 times a day and individualize or personalize their achievable challenge program, but one at a time, one level at a time. When other students see the impact that something is having that you're doing on their classmates, they say, okay, I can do it too, especially when they understand that their brain will do what it believes is the outcome. They have to know that they weren't bad, stupid, attention disease. They didn't have Tourette syndrome or seizure disorder, because some of those kids will come to me in my neurology office, and like 1 in 100 has those things. So whatever they've been told they have is unlikely to be who they will be. You wake up with a new brain every morning, and the opportunities, the experiences, the positive expectations that we give them changes them every day.
Well, thank you so much, Judy, for coming on the podcast, for giving me so much of your time, and for explaining the neuroscience behind how students are learning. I really appreciate you giving us that.
My pleasure. Great questions. Achievable challenge achieved.
Thank you so much. Well, that's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you subscribe and that you leave me a great review. I'd love to hear from you.